The air in Harbin during August of 1945 was thick enough to drink, a humid cocktail of coal dust, sorghum pollen, and a city's sweat. Inside the sterile white walls of the Kwantung Army Field Hospital, Nurse Akiko Tanaka felt a world away from the war. Here, the only battles were against infection, despair, and the sweltering Manchurian heat that defied the whirring of electric fans. The war, for her, was a distant rumble, a name on a map. Okinawa, Burma, places that felt as remote as the moon. General Otozo Yamada's Kwantung Army was the shield of the empire here, an invincible force, or so the papers claimed. "They say the Americans have a new kind of bomb," whispered Emi Sato, her senior colleague, as they changed dressings on a soldier with a bandaged stump for a leg. Emi's eyes, unlike Akiko's, held no patriotic fire, only a deep, weary cynicism. One that can burn a city to ash in a single flash. Akiko straightened a crisp sheet. "Propaganda, Emi-san. We must trust in the Emperor and the strength of our soldiers." She was 21, and her faith was as starched and clean as her uniform. She still wrote letters home describing the beautiful parks of Harbin, avoiding the grim reality of the wards. But even her optimism was fraying. The rumors were changing. They weren't about the distant Americans anymore. They were whispers that slithered in with the supply trucks from the north. Whispers of a different enemy. The Soviets. For years, a non-aggression pact had kept the Manchurian border quiet. Now, the men in the political office spoke in low, urgent tones of Marshal Vasilevsky massing over 1 million men across the Amur River. The silence from the border felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The invincible Kwantung Army, stripped of its best divisions for battles in the Pacific, was a hollow shell. Everyone knew it, but no one dared say it aloud. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, August 8, 1945. The heat is unrelenting. Another train of wounded arrived from the south today. Their eyes are different. Not the defiant look of our brave soldiers, but something hollow. Emi says it's the look of an ending. I scolded her, but tonight I feel a chill the fan cannot explain. The radio is silent on the Manchurian border. Father always said that in the country the loudest sound before a storm is the silence. Is a storm coming for us? The storm broke at dawn on August 9th. It wasn't thunder that woke Akiko. It was a deep, guttural roar that shook the hospital's foundations, rattling glass in its frames. A sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky. She and Emi rushed to a window, pressing their faces against the cool pane. On the horizon, toward the Sungari River, the sky was on fire. A wave of orange and black billowed upwards, pulsing with a malevolent light. The red tide had come. The world Akiko knew, of sterile order, dutiful purpose, and unquestioning faith, was about to be washed away in a torrent of steel and blood. The day that followed was a fever dream of chaos. The invincible Kwantung Army, the famed shield of the empire, shattered like glass. The hospital, once a place of ordered recovery, became the final desperate collection point for a broken army. Trucks and carts dumped bleeding, dust-caked men at their doors, their stories a disjointed chorus of disbelief and terror. "Tanks!" A young officer with shrapnel in his chest gasped to Akiko. They came through the Khingan Mountains, a place no army could cross. They just appeared. General Yamada's headquarters was in disarray. Conflicting orders crackled over the radio before falling silent altogether. Evacuate, stand and fight, surrender. The chain of command had dissolved. For Akiko, the political speeches and patriotic songs that had once filled her with pride now seemed like a cruel joke. The real war was not one of spirit, but of steel, and the Soviets had an overwhelming abundance of it. She and Emmy worked without rest, their white uniforms stained with the blood of boys who had been told they were invincible. Emmy's cynical commentary had ceased. In its place was a grim, mechanical efficiency, her movements sharp and brittle. The fear was too great for words. Miles away, Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, attached to the 6th Guards Tank Army, tasted dust and victory. The advance had been breathtakingly fast, a testament to Marshal Vasilevsky's meticulous planning. They had punched through the Japanese defenses in hours, the demoralized and under-equipped Kwantung soldiers barely offering resistance. Dmitry, a former linguistics student from Moscow, was an anomaly in the fighting force. His job was not to pull a trigger, but to translate the surrender. He had seen little but the backs of fleeing Japanese soldiers and the bewildered faces of Chinese locals who watched the red-starred tanks roll past with a mixture of fear and hope. From the testimony of Emi Sato, recorded 1947, we knew it was over when the artillery stopped. For 2 days it was a constant rumble, the sound of the world ending. Then, on the 3rd day, silence. It was worse than the noise. We just waited. We tried to hide the morphine, burn the most sensitive documents. The head doctor, a good man, told us to remain calm, to remember our duty as medical personnel. He was pale as a ghost. We all were. We could hear the tanks on the main road, the squeal of their treads getting closer. It was the sound of a closing cage. The silence in the hospital was broken by the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel outside. Akiko, her hands frozen while trying to comfort a whimpering soldier, looked up. The double doors of the main ward burst open, slamming against the walls. Sunlight streamed in, silhouetting 3 figures in unfamiliar drab-green uniforms, rifles held at the ready. In the center stood a young officer, his face smudged with dirt, his expression one of exhaustion and authority. It was Dmitry Volkov. His blue eyes, shockingly out of place in the sea of dark-haired patients and staff, swept across the room, cataloging the scene of carnage and fear. He cleared his throat, and in formal, textbook-perfect Japanese, he made the announcement that sealed their fate. By order of the Trans-Baikal Front Command, this facility is now under the control of the Red Army. You are all prisoners of war. The first days of captivity were an exercise in organized humiliation. The hospital's Japanese staff, once respected professionals, were now a labor force. Akiko found herself scrubbing floors she used to walk with authority, her hands raw from the harsh soap. The Soviet soldiers were a constant, unnerving presence. They moved with a casual confidence, their conversations in the harsh, guttural Russian tongue a constant reminder of who was in charge. They smoked cheap, acrid tobacco that clung to the curtains and replaced the sterile scent of antiseptic. Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov became the reluctant face of their new reality. He was polite, his Japanese precise, but his eyes held a professional distance that was impossible to breach. He translated the orders of a portly Soviet major who had taken over the hospital administration. The women will handle laundry and sanitation, Dmitry announced one morning, not meeting their eyes. The male doctors will assist our medical staff as ordered. All Japanese military patients are to be confined to the East Wing. The hierarchy they had lived by was erased, replaced by a simple, brutal one: victor and vanquished. Emmy adapted with a survivor's instinct. "Don't look them in the eye," she hissed at Akiko one afternoon as they hauled buckets of dirty water. "Don't ask questions. Be invisible. We are not nurses anymore. We are just a number." Akiko tried to follow her advice, but her spirit rebelled. She saw a young Soviet medic roughly handle a Japanese patient and had to physically restrain herself from intervening. Her purpose, to heal, to care, had been stolen, leaving a hollow ache of powerlessness. She was no longer Tanaka-san, the diligent nurse. She was prisoner Nager 73, a designation scrawled on a tag she was forced to wear. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, August 15, 1945, the radio in the major's office was loud today. We could hear it through the door. Then there was a strange, high-pitched voice. One of the Japanese doctors who was cleaning the hallway stopped. He stood completely still, and then he began to weep. He said it was the Emperor. His voice, I've never heard it before. He was announcing the surrender. It is over. All of it. For nothing. I feel empty. There is no more nation to serve, no more victory to hope for. There's only this hospital, these guards, and the waiting. Waiting for what? The Emperor's broadcast did not bring liberation. It only cemented their status as prisoners. A week later, Dmitry Volkov assembled all 23 female nurses and aides in the main hall. The Soviet major stood beside him, arms crossed, his face impassive. The air grew thick with a new kind of dread. This was not about work duties. Dmitry cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just above their heads. For the purposes of state documentation and administrative processing, he began, his voice flat, a mere conduit for the Russian words the major had just spoken. A complete profile of all prisoners is required. Tomorrow morning, you will all report to the main examination room. You are to undergo a full physical evaluation. A nervous murmur rippled through the women. Emmy shot Akiko a warning glance. Dmitry paused, and the final words landed like stones in the suffocating silence. We need to measure your bodies. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The cold, bureaucratic phrase hung in the air, stripped of any medical context. It was not about their health. It was about cataloging them, reducing their existence to a set of numbers on a state file. It was the ultimate act of possession. In that moment, Akiko understood what Emmy meant. They were no longer even numbers. They were becoming objects. The morning of the inspection was cold, despite the late August sun. A palpable dread had descended upon the women's quarters, a silence heavier than any before. They walked to the examination room not as a group, but as 23 individuals, each trapped in her own bubble of apprehension. The room had been stripped of its familiar medical equipment. In its place stood a simple wooden table with a measuring tape, a large metal caliper, and a ledger, presided over by a stern-faced Soviet woman in a military uniform they didn't recognize. She was not a doctor or a nurse. Her demeanor was that of a quartermaster taking inventory. Dmitry Volkov stood by the door, his role reduced to that of a shepherd. He looked paler than usual, his jaw tight. He refused to meet anyone's eyes, focusing instead on the frayed edges of his own cuffs. The Soviet major was absent, having delegated the odious task. The process was brutally simple and devoid of any human warmth. The woman barked a number. One by one, they were forced to step forward. Undress. The command, translated by Dmitry in a choked whisper, was a physical blow. In their culture, the body was a private temple, its exposure an act reserved for the most intimate or dire medical necessities. This was neither. This was a violation disguised as bureaucracy. Hesitation was met with an impatient gesture from the woman, a sharp rap of her pen on the ledger. Akiko watched as the first nurse, a girl younger than herself, trembled as she removed her uniform, her hands shaking so violently she could barely unfasten the buttons. She stood small and exposed on the cold floor. The woman was methodical. She measured height and weight. Then she picked up the cold steel of the caliper. She measured the width of their shoulders, the circumference of their hips, the length of their limbs. The most chilling part was the measurement of their skulls, the cold metal points pressing against their temples and foreheads as if they were livestock being assessed for their traits. The woman's touch was impersonal, rough, her focus entirely on the numbers she was recording in the ledger. It was a complete and utter depersonalization. They were being reduced to anthropological data points, specimens for a detached and alien science. From the testimony of Junior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, questioned 1953. Did I know what it was for? Not exactly. We were told it was for state records. Anthropometry. It was a science, they said, a way to understand the physical characteristics of the conquered population. That is the official explanation. Unofficially, it was about power. It was to show them that we owned everything, even their bodies. I translated the words. I stood there. I did not protest. To protest would have been unwise. My job was to obey. But I remember their faces, the shame, the quiet tears of the woman they called Akiko. You do not forget such things. You carry them. When it was Akiko's turn, she felt a wave of icy fury rise within her. Her pride, the last vestige of her identity, screamed in protest. She looked past the impassive woman, her gaze landing directly on Dmitri. For the first time, she forced him to meet her eyes. In them, he saw not just fear or shame, but a burning accusation. He flinched, his face flushing, and quickly looked away. The moment was fleeting, but it was a small, silent victory. As the cold caliper touched her skin, Akiko closed her eyes. She thought of her home in Nagasaki, of the cherry blossoms in the temple garden. She forced her body not to tremble, her face to remain a mask of stone. They could measure her flesh and bone. They could write their numbers in their ledger, but they could not touch the person inside. She would not grant them the satisfaction of her tears. As she was dismissed, she walked past Emmy, whose turn was next. "Be strong," Akiko whispered, a single act of defiance in a room built for subjugation. The humiliation was a fire, but inside that fire, a new, harder substance was being forged. The silence that followed the inspection was different. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence from before the invasion, nor the fearful silence under the first days of occupation. This was a brittle, crystalline silence, born of a shared trauma too profound for words. Back in their crowded quarters, the women avoided each other's eyes, as if gazing at a fellow nurse would be a mirror to their own degradation. It was Emmy who finally broke it, her voice a dry rasp. "Well," she said, staring at the ceiling, "at least they know our sizes for the coffins." No one laughed. Akiko didn't reply. She sat on her cot and methodically cleaned the dirt from under her fingernails with a small twig. It was a simple, private act of reclamation. They had touched her, catalogued her, reduced her to a series of measurements in a ledger. But her hands were still her own. A cold, hard resolve was settling where her idealism used to be. The fire of humiliation had not consumed her. It had forged her. She was no longer a servant of a lost empire or a cog in a medical machine. She was Akiko Tanaka, prisoner, Shat 73, and her survival would be her own victory. A few days later, as she was carrying a slop bucket through a quiet corridor, a voice called her name. Not her number, but her name. "Tanaka-san." She turned. It was Dmitry Volkov, standing alone. His face was etched with an unease that went beyond the weariness of war. He looked not at her, but at the wall beside her. "I studied literature," he said abruptly in his formal Japanese, the words rushing out. "Not this, not anthropometry." He finally met her gaze, and for a moment the uniform vanished. She saw not a Soviet officer, but a young man burdened by his role. "They are sending you away," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "All of you. Soon. To the north." He didn't need to say the word. Siberia. The name itself was a sentence. "It will be cold," he added, a useless, pathetic, human offering. He then turned and walked away before she could respond, leaving Akiko standing in the hallway with the weight of that terrible knowledge. From the diary of Akiko Tanaka, entry dated uncertain, late August 1945. We are on a train. The doors are sealed. It moves endlessly north. The world outside is a blur of green and brown. We are packed so tightly we can barely breathe, but there is a strange comfort in it. We are not alone. Yesterday, the young officer told me our destination. It was not an act of cruelty, I think, but of penance. A final small acknowledgement that we are people, not just cargo. They measured our bodies. They put calipers to our skulls and wrote their figures in a book. But as I sit here in the dark, I think of my mother's face. I remember the taste of persimmons from our garden. I can feel the phantom warmth of a patient's hand I once held. These are the things that make me who I am. And they cannot measure a memory. They cannot weigh a feeling. They cannot put a caliper to a soul. The train rumbled on, carrying its human freight into the vast, unforgiving heart of the continent. Inside the dark, swaying boxcar, Akiko sat with her back straight, eyes open in the darkness. The journey of prisoner number 73 had just begun. Her body was captive, her future stolen, but the unmeasured, unrecorded part of her, the part that remembered and endured, remained defiantly and absolutely free.